That's a nice job you did with that
And oh, look at that. So talented.
seamless.
Okay, so today we're going to be talking about rodenticides. But first, as always, I want to say thank you to viewers like you for supporting our Backyard Naturalist series. If you're not a subscriber, you can become a subscriber. We have seasonal and annual subscriptions, and UEC members get 20% off. And this gives you access to our weekly lectures, monthly field trip, and our subscriber appreciation party. So one other thing we'll take a look at.
I was born with 2 left eyes, so sometimes it is harder for me to, use binoculars.
The Green Birding Challenge soared into existence with the help of Tim Vargo, a man with 2 pairs of binoculars and 1 dream.
Some people get a bit jealous. Hey, you can't film this.
Some people may call it superstition, but I like to, at the start of every competition, hang and display all of our t-shirts from years past. I'm really looking forward to it. It's going to have the energy of champions, green birding champions.
Gather your family for the adventure of the spring, coming soon.
We won't watch it. We can watch it again. So that is a promotional video for our Green Birding Challenge and our Bruce City Birding Festival. Our marketing department is going to post the full film next week to talk about what happens at the Green Birding Challenge and how to sign up and all of that. But our Bruce City Birding Festival, as Tim mentioned, it's going to have a lot of great programs this year, including Horcon, hummingbird banding, bird art workshop, and more. So put it on your calendars. May 12th through the 19th with our Green Birding Challenge taking place on May 13th. Okay, we'll get into what we're going to talk about today. So rodents are pretty much everywhere. We've heard from Tim all about rats in particular, particularly the Norway rat, but we'll also look kind of at the house mouse today. They're super smart, really adaptable. They have this generalist diet, so they'll eat things like pizza crust, as well as like normal things like fruit and seeds. But they're really tightly intertwined with human history, and for a long time we've been battling with them. And this battle is pretty much as old as the practice of agriculture. Pest control has been around for centuries. The ancient Egyptians saw cats as protectors and used them to control pests in their grain stores. And they were critical in the domestication of the African wildcat. And that's what got us our domestic house cat of today. Dogs were also super important in the history of rodent control. There are several breeds that are bred to be ratters, or dogs that like to chase and kill rats. Dogs like the rat terrier, schnauzers, pinschers were all bred to get rodents out and keep them away. And humans had their own part to play in pest control. Rat catchers have been around since the Middle Ages. The legend of the Pied Piper and him playing and luring all the rats out of the town was a symbol of hope during the Black Plague. More modern day rat catchers use ratter dogs, guns, all kinds of things, and they were often paid per rat. Today, rat catchers are better known as pest control agents. And the modernization of the profession has come with the modernization of the technique. And so today, one of the most popular forms of rodent control is poison, otherwise known as rodenticide. Particularly today, we're going to be looking at anti-coagulant rodenticides. But rodenticides are popular because people don't like dealing with rodents, whether they're dead or alive. So this solution seems like the best option to many people because poison is placed in these black boxes, and it's left for rodents to feed on in the hopes that they will go somewhere else to die. The baits contain artificial scents and flavoring, as well as seeds to attract rodents to eat them. And these are a few that I found in my neighborhood. So you can see all the places that I go. But yeah, it's something I notice a lot now is just walking around, you see all these black boxes, and those are all rodenticides. But while pest control is an old practice, anticoagulant rodenticides aren't. The story of how rodenticides came to be starts right here in Wisconsin, actually, in the 1920s. And the star of the show is this plant, the sweet clover. So in the 1920s, dairy farmers were dealing with major losses of their cattle. What was happening was all their cattle were essentially bleeding out and dying. Eventually, they identified that moldy sweet clover hay was what was causing this massive hemorrhaging, but no one really knew why that was. And so one of those farmers took a milk can of cow's blood, as well as a barrel of sweet clover, all the way to the University of Wisconsin, where he met a biochemist named Carl Link. And Carl Link set out to try and solve this mystery of what was causing these cows to just hemorrhage uncontrollably. And what they discovered was this compound dicumarol, which inhibits clotting in many mammals and is produced when the fungus that was causing the mold reacts with a substance in the sweet clover called coumarin. This led to warfarin. Many of you might be familiar with warfarin. It's a very popular drug that I'll talk briefly about, but it was initially marketed as a rat poison because of just how potent it was. Warfarin still remains one of the most popular rat poisons on the market. And what it does is it interrupts the process involved in clot formation. So warfarin, along with many other anticoagulants, are vitamin K antagonists, meaning they work by interfering with the production of vitamin K, which slows down the clotting process. Essentially, vitamin K activates these platelets, which leads to the development of a clot. The higher your dosage of the anticoagulant, the less likely your blood is to clot. In humans, warfarin and other anticoagulants are life-saving drugs that when taken in controlled doses can help prevent things like deep vein thrombosis, pulmonary embolisms, strokes, and heart attacks. But they're taking usually a very small dose that is managed by a pharmacist as well as a doctor. With rodents, they can take an unlimited dosage because they can just repeatedly feed on baits. They take a huge dose, which significantly reduces their body's ability to clot and increases their risk of bleeding. So even just the slightest bump could cause excessive and uncontrolled internal bleeding, which eventually leads to their death. While they're still alive, and being affected by the poison, they become very weak and lethargic, as well as disoriented. They get very, very thirsty because they're just hemorrhaging blood, which often drives them to water because of the thirst. They look kind of wet and gross all the time. And they can potentially drown because of this. But poison doesn't just affect rats. In a review of published literature, it's been reported that 55% of non-target animals investigated were found to have residual accumulation of anticoagulant rodenticides. So this can be just about anything. It accumulates up the food web. In California, it has been found in over 29 non-target species, including the endangered San Joaquin kit fox. What happens is rodenticides don't discriminate. They're just put out in these black boxes, while pests like rats and mice are the target. It doesn't stop other wildlife from testing it out. Because of the effects of the rodenticides, the animals that directly consume it typically become very easy prey, leading to secondary and then tertiary exposure in higher predators. Smaller animals like squirrels and rabbits, skunks, as well as raccoons, with their long arms and their little hands, can easily get into these bait boxes and consume enough to kill them. I've personally seen a raccoon that directly consumed rodenticides, resulting in its death. In non-target felines like mountain lions and bobcats, the poison itself, these higher tertiary consumers, the poison isn't really what kills them. It's typically secondary disease. So in bobcats, it's been found that exposure to anticoagulant rodenticides causes immune system dysregulation, and exposed bobcats are 7 times more likely to die of mange than those that had never had a rodenticide exposure. Mange is a parasitic disease caused by a mite, and this mite burrows into an animal's skin, and it causes really intense itchiness, as well as hair thinning and loss, thickened skin, and scabbing. Hair loss is most common around the face and the ears, as well as the tail, which are the places that they can most easily reach to scratch. But eventually it can cause an animal to lose most of its fur, and they will die of exposure because they can't really regulate their body temperature. They have a difficult time consuming enough calories to keep themselves fed, as well as their body that's trying to fight off this infection. And they can get secondary bacterial infections as well, which can kill them. In raptors, there's a very serious concern when it comes to secondary poisoning. Raptor diets consist of probably 70 to 80% rodent prey. In many cases, it's not all, obviously, but they consume a lot of rodents. And because of this, raptors are essentially taking repeated doses of anticoagulants by eating rodents that already have massive amounts of rodenticides in them, which eventually leads to their death. Tufts University reported that between 2012 and 2016, 90% of the raptors they tested were positive for second-generation anticoagulants. And this isn't just a problem in wildlife. It can be a problem with your household pets as well as your children. All can become unintentionally poisoned, either by getting into the box itself, they're not entirely tamper-proof, or by getting into loose pellets or contaminated soil. So rodenticides can come in pellet form, which can just be loose in boxes, and the rodents that easily can get in can usually distribute them outside the box, which leads to large dogs and children becoming unintentionally poisoned. This is technically no longer allowed under the EPA's regulations. But as we'll talk about in a bit, that doesn't stop people from buying loose rodenticide pellets and keeping them in boxes. Today, there are 2 classes of anticoagulant rodenticides on the market, first generation and second generation. Second generation anticoagulants were developed due to the development of warfarin resistance in rats. They are extremely potent. First generation typically require the target animal to feed multiple times on the bait before it results in their death. Second generation only need 1 feeding before they can really work their magic, I guess. They're so toxic, in fact, that the EPA restricts purchase and application, making it so these compounds should not be available on the public market. But of course, this isn't the case. The internet has created a huge rodenticide problem, and many online storefronts go unregulated, meaning anyone off the street, you don't have to be a licensed pest control agent, can go online and purchase a second generation compound. And you can purchase huge quantities of it for a relatively inexpensive cost from sites like this one, Do It Yourself Pest Control, even eBay and Walmart, as well as Amazon, all sell second generation anticoagulant rodenticides, even though this is not allowed under EPA restrictions. You can see this one. This one's apple flavor. So I just told you a bunch of really sad stuff. What's the solution? There's not a whole lot that can be done about the individual sale of these chemicals, other than calling your representatives and encouraging them to press for regulation, stronger and stricter regulation of these chemicals. But there are a lot of alternatives that you yourself can use and encourage others to use, including your local government and local businesses. Starting with just trying to discourage rats from coming onto your property. They love a free buffet. Things like unsecured trash, pet food left outside, compost that is not secured, fruit and vegetable garden, birdseed, all of that they love. So doing things like making sure your compost and your trash are secure, cleaning up any fallen fruit and harvesting as soon as possible, keeping bird feeders away from your house, at least a considerable distance, and not leaving any pet food outside for your dog or your cat. Also just trimming trees and shrubs so they aren't overhanging your house, filling any holes, cracks, or gaps around your property, and keeping things that they would use as habitat, like shrubs or wood piles, away from your property. Well, not away from your house itself. But sometimes it's just not really preventable. Rats and mice are around and they're here to stay, especially in a city like Milwaukee. And we like our gardens and our bird feeders. So I'm not necessarily telling you to get rid of these things. But if you have a rat problem because of these things, what are some things that you can do? You can use traps that kill instantly. Things like this shock trap, snap traps, or this newer trap called the A24, which uses CO2 to cause blunt force trauma to rats. These can cause problems. They are still open to non-target wildlife. So especially with things like snap traps, you should never really use out in the open where other wildlife like birds and raccoons really can't really get to them. If you're not really keen on killing your rodent population, there are a lot of humane options that you can use. Things like cage traps. These are both multiple rodent cage traps as well as bucket traps. They sell these online where it's just a low ladder and a drop door. You drop them into a 5-gallon bucket. But you can also DIY it pretty easily with like a can and some wire and just smear some peanut butter on it. But then you'll just have to relocate and release your captured friends. If you really don't want to deal with rodents, whether they're alive or dead, there are some natural solutions you can use. Apparently, they really dislike cayenne, so you can sprinkle that around, and it doesn't really affect birds in particular, so you don't need to worry about it deterring your birds at feeders. They also market natural bio repellents that you can buy, as well as rodent birth control. This they don't really sell in the open market. You'd have to contact a pest control agent specifically. One of the best things to do, and probably one of the most appealing solutions to this group, is to encourage beneficial raptors to nest around your property. They are a great natural pest management tool. And so by encouraging them, you can better manage a pest problem without having to use traps or repellents or rodenticides in particular. So setting up things like nest boxes for barn owls or peregrines or kestrels, as well as nest platforms for ospreys and other hawks, or even just artificial perches for all kinds of raptors will encourage them to show up and hunt the land. If none of this is working for you, or there are certain things that you just can't do because it's not realistic, is to contact a professional and contact a professional that is an integrated pest management professional. IPM professionals manage pests using science. They first identify and monitor what the problem is. They evaluate the impacts of the pests and take steps to prevent it, and ultimately continuously monitor. They use a variety of techniques where the first step is just to try and prevent the pest problem from even developing. And things like pesticides and traps and other things like that are more of like last resorts. One thing for sure is that you should never use glue traps. Glue traps are incredibly inhumane. They capture all kinds of wildlife victims like birds, snakes, rats, and these animals suffer. They die because of either dehydration or starvation. So even if you're wanting to kill and get rid of target rodents, it's still incredibly inhumane to use these kinds of traps. Ultimately, the law is probably our best solution for discontinuing the widespread use of poison on a broader scale. And more municipalities are taking that up. In 2021, California outlawed the use of second-generation anti-coagulant rodenticides across the state. after a very long campaign from California Fish and Wildlife Department, Citizens for Los Angeles Wildlife, and the Santa Monica Mountains Break the Chain project. More recently, BC has done the same, and more campaigns are working to educate the public and bring attention to the problem, as well as get laws on the books. But is there ever an appropriate instance to use rodenticides? Rodenticides should really be your last resort, but many scientists strongly believe that rodenticides are really, really necessary when you're dealing with an invasive rat problem. So, because of human activity over the course of history, rodents have been introduced and are non-native on many islands, especially in the polar regions. And they cause a huge problem for seabirds. So places like the Aleutian Islands once had a huge non-native invasive rat problem. And seabirds are incredibly important because they act as ecological connectors through their migration routes. And I was really hoping that Tori would be here today, and I'm so glad that she is, because I included this slide about poo. Because they're super important in nutrient cycling. They cycle nutrients into the marine ecosystem, out of and into the marine ecosystem. And their poop is a really great fertilizer. It enhances coral growth and reef recovery. And ammonia from their droppings actually helps create cooling clouds over polar regions. So it has a huge effect on the ecosystem and the environment at large. And so with invasive rats eating their eggs, eating parts of them even, and just generally causing a lot of problems, many scientists use massive amounts of anti-coagulant rodenticides. On the Aleutian Islands, they dropped 300 metric tons of poisoned bait using helicopters. And this does unfortunately result in some casualties. In this study in particular, they found 41 bald eagles and 186 gulls ultimately died because of secondary rodenticide poisoning. But a few casualties is okay in the grander scheme of things, because rats are now eradicated and seabirds are recovering, and they're even seeing seabirds that they have never recorded on these islands. And so we'll end with some cute dogs. These dogs are sort of ratters, but they were hired on the South Georgian islands after they went through their rat eradication campaign they're essentially detection dogs. So they went and hiked pretty much the entire landscape trying to find any evidence of rats, and the three of them found nothing. So a little heartwarming story to end. And I'll stop sharing.